Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
Season 3, Episode 9, the one about Sanatan Dharma. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast in a special collaboration with Kundi on the decolonisation of RE. This is the third time Ash has been on the RE podcast, once looking at authenticity as a general concept and once with Dr. Jasjeet Singh on decolonising the teaching of Sikhi. This is the second in a special series of the RE podcast looking at the decolonisation of RE. Today we are joined by Molly Acharya, who is also a previous guest on the podcast. We together are going to look at how we decolonise the teaching of Sanatan Dharma so we can make it more authentic. Ash, welcome back. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you, Louisa. Yeah, as always, it's nice to be back. How are you?
I'm very, very well. I'm very excited about this. But just remind us before we start of what decolonisation means in terms of our curriculum.
So decolonisation is looking at the lenses in which we actually provide subject knowledge to our students and looking at how we look to essentially portray certain communities within our curriculum and also making sure that it's as authentic as possible and that it's not just about diversity. It's about authentic representation and that we're teaching about particular communities as it is rather than what we think it is. Essentially making sure that we've got those authentic, accurately representative mirrors for our students in the classroom.
Brilliant. And I think the reaction from Twitter is that these podcasts have been really helpful. So I know that it's having an effect, which is amazing. Molly, let me welcome you back to the RE podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thanks, Louisa. My name is Molly Acharya. I am a teacher of RE, have been teaching for over 20 years, and I am a member of the Hindu community, as is Ash. I'm first generation born here, and I have great insight into the world of Sanatan Dharma and how we can place it within our schemes of RE in the world we teach in today.
Fabulous. And actually, just to pick on something you said, because what I want to ask you about is to clarify the most authentic language we can use. So obviously what we've tried to do is use Sanatan Dharma. Why is that a better term to use than Hindu or Hinduism?
The term Hinduism is a kind of sectarian term that's being used and was kind of put into place when India was colonised at the time of the Raj. And probably because it was difficult for people to say and pronounce at that time. So they also used to call India, which should have been Bharat, they used to call it Hindustan as well. So it kind of makes sense that they linked the religion to the geographical location. But actually, Sanatan Dharma is far more than just a geographical location. And most adherents of the faith prefer to call it Sanatan Dharma. Now, in the classroom, some of us might find some of our students aren't familiar with that term, and if you were to start saying we're doing about Sanatan Dharma next term, they wouldn't necessarily understand what you're talking about. I know my students wouldn't because it's not a term they're familiar with. So for those students, it might be better to use the term Hindu Dharma initially to get them used to the thinking along those lines. And then when they're used to it, then you can start dropping in Sanatan a bit more fluently for them.
Fabulous. And Ash, is there anything you want to say on that same subject?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with pretty much everything that Molly's actually referring to there in terms of actually building towards the authentic language, because Sanatan Dharma is often a term that, not a lot of young people will, and to be perfectly honest, not a lot of people from the Sanatan community will necessarily be actually au fait with as well until it's actually brought to them. So yeah, it does need to be built up towards it. And then that's where you give an opportunity to look at that historical context as well. Some of the examples that I was perhaps thinking of was some really quick fire examples. So referring to Hindu places of gatherings, I suppose, like as a Mandir rather than a temple. So for example, usually within dharmic faiths or dharmic traditions, people often refer to community areas or places of worship as temples rather than the actual specific names of the areas. So for example, Mandir for Sanatanis, for Sikh it would be Gurdwara, for Buddhists it would be Vihara. But then what's happened with dharmic faiths is that people have tried essentially just kind of created this umbrella term of temple to make it more convenient. What the risk of that is that it strips away the individual identities and strips away a lot of the authenticity when it comes to, for example, where people will meet up and be mindful and pray with each other. I think a really important one is the Swasti. So, for example, people will usually refer to it as swastika. Now, the authentic swastika in terms of the Nazi symbol really should be referred to as Hackenkreuz, but it's still referred to as swastika. People sometimes will associate the Nazi symbol with Sanatan Dharma and start thinking about, oh, hang on, where's the link here, and start thinking that it's extreme to that level. So I think if we ensure that we're referring to, when we talk about the Nazi symbol, referring to it as Hackenkreuz and not swastika, I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to do and to separate the two. And I think just to go into swastis, so the su part roughly translates to good, and asti is about existence, so ensuring that we have a prosperous and good existence. And the 4 parts of swasti refer to plant life, human life, the elements, and animal life, and all that bringing together, living in harmony effectively, refers to a good existence. And it's meant to be a harmonious symbol, but obviously, unfortunately, when you first start teaching about this, sometimes when you're talking about lessons within Sanatan Dharma, the first thing that will come into a kid's head is often, hang on, that's a Nazi symbol. And then you have to have that conversation. I think something that can make that a lot easier is if we differentiate between the two pretty early, really. I think also the word Varna rather than caste. Caste comes from a Portuguese word, casta, which roughly translates to this idea of lineage, where Varna, in its most authentic way, has nothing to do with lineage and birthright and things like that. So Varna is based on your virtues more than anything else. So I think they're just a few terms that I would perhaps initially probably like to pick up on, because they're often the ones that are, in essence, probably most misrepresented through the lack of knowledge, really, I suppose, on authentic language within Sanatan Dharma.
Can I just go back to the Swasti point that you said, Ash, there? I think it's a good point to have a discussion with your history colleagues to make sure that that is a point that they are enforcing within their curricula as well, because if the whole school is doing it, then the students understand it, whereas if they get swastika in history and then we're saying it's Hackenkreuz in RE, then it'll confuse them. Yeah. So it's better to have that holistic approach within your school. And so therefore, it'd be good if teaching staff from both departments talk to each other there. I'd also add to that list the concept of Murti instead of using the word idol. Because even within our own community, if you look at some of our social media pages, we even also have Hindus calling Murtis idols. And the not idol means a false image. Whereas Murti is the idea that God's presence is within that image that people worship. And so we have got instances of people mistreating Murtis, but they don't understand how Hindus revere those Murtis within their homes or within their mandirs. Or if you were in India, you'd see them on the roadside as well. So that, I would think, is another key concept that non-Hindus might find is better to use the word Murti rather than the concept idol there.
Really helpful. And I think what we could do is do like a little glossary and put it in the show notes so that people can then refer back to a term that's currently used, a better term to use, and then a quick explanation of why. And we could just summarise that, because I think that's really helpful. And I think a great idea then to work in collaboration with other departments. So actually they're getting a consistent message and it's more likely to make sense to them rather than confuse them.
Sorry, Louisa, would you mind if I just quickly added on to something
Not at all, no.
Molly said? Because I'm just going to give a personal experience here. I live in an area where it's predominantly white British, and basically there's not a lot of knowledge on Sanatan Dharma or anything like that until somebody asks, effectively. So I'm just giving that context. And what we'll often have, so my son had his munnan, which is basically to shave off the hair to get rid of previous life's dharma and then move forward, effectively. And the pandit, the person that was running the munnan, Sindur, he created a swasti sign on his head. Now, for the untrained eye, looking at a swasti on a child's head, you'd be thinking, hang on, this is some kind of Nazi baby, almost. That's got this swasti on his head. He's been anointed with this symbol, which is so dear to the Sanatan community. And the thing is that because there's been such a misrepresentation of it, there's almost like this constant justification that comes with it. So another example is when we were celebrating Diwali, my mother wanted to put just something like a little door sort of decoration. It had swastis on there. But I said to her, Mum, if somebody walks past and sees that, we've got a lot more questions to answer than going to be a lot more frowns than it is smiles, put it that way. And obviously it's picking your battles, I suppose. And the thing is that sometimes your family isn't necessarily in the best position to have those discussions all of the time, and probably tend to have them in more structured environments rather than someone coming and challenging you at your door. So I just wanted to put those couple of examples across. They're just two pragmatic examples in everyday life for people.
Really helpful. And just again highlights the importance of RE and the conversations we're having with our students in RE, that it just hopefully over time, we just replace that knowledge with accurate knowledge, which would be wonderful. What else other than about language should we do to make our teaching of Sanatan Dharma more authentic?
I think one of the key concepts that a lot of people struggle with is the concept of the divine within Hindu Dharma. And generally, people think that Hindus believe in lots and lots of gods. Certain books say 33 million, but actually, fundamentally, Hindus believe in one. But you will, across the Indian subcontinent, have people who are devotees of one of the main avatars of that fundamental one, because that helps people to understand the whole concept of the one. Also, the geography does come into it with Hindu Dharma, because it's such a large country, you are going to get diversity, huge diversity and sub-diversity and diversity again. So if people use the 6 blind men and the elephant story that shows different perceptions of an ultimate reality, the ultimate reality symbolised by the elephant, and the 6 blind men sort of are all the different people in the world and how we see the bigger picture. And it's only until we all join together and put all those concepts together that you get the ultimate big picture, but it's beyond our comprehension. And so having these Murtis, having these different avatars helps us to understand this huge, vast concept of the divine to some extent, but we will still always be limited in our understanding, no matter what we try and do. Because we're human, we can never reach the ultimate divine, and that's what distinguishes us from the divine.
Yeah. I mean, that imagery of the blind people and the elephant is so powerful. So if anybody hasn't come across that, I'm sure you have, but we'll just put a link to it in the show notes as well. And obviously feel free to DM us and ask us a bit more about it, because it's such a great analogy. Ash, is there anything else that you feel that we need to teach better other than language?
So yeah, just adding on to what Moni was talking about perceptions of the divine, if you like. This is where it's really important to understand terms like Brahman, for example, and understanding it as ultimate reality. It's not necessarily just about God, which is a very Abrahamic lens to be looking at through towards dharmic faith, because this idea of God is not necessarily applicable towards the whole Sanatan community. So, for example, you can be an atheist and still be Sanatani, for example. For example, Sankhya philosophers that would be happy to embrace that, as well as finding out what the ultimate reality is. And I think that's something that we need to improve on a little bit. So, for example, if I was to just explain it in this way, so, for example, there's us 3 here. We all experience life differently, so therefore we'll have different perceptions of what life is. So therefore, because of those different experiences of life, our experiences of the divine will be different. Our perceptions of the world around us will be different as well. So it's not about, whilst we've all got different realities, there is one specific reality, but it's about seeking rather than just knowing it all. Basically, we're constantly seekers. And it's quite similar to what just Jeet was talking about actually in the previous podcast, that we have this idea of being a seeker and not being someone that kind of is aware of the absolute truth, because none of us are, for a Sanatan perspective. And I think one thing that we do quite well as a teaching community, we engage really well with stories. I think we engage really well with the stories. We're very good storytellers. However, I think what I'd probably like to see more of is engaging with the deeper symbolic meaning of certain stories as well. So, for example, the story of Ganesh's head being chopped off by his father Shivji will often be a story that, like, how can a Hindu think that literally happened? And there's not many Sanatanis or Hindus that will think that genuinely literally happened. There's a deep symbolic meaning behind a story like that. But then also you get the question like, well, hang on, so if you went to go and look for an elephant head, why didn't you just get the original head and put that head back on? That's quite logical thinking. Those questions are going to come up, and sometimes if we don't understand the deeper symbolic meaning behind these stories, that's where you can get found out as a teacher, because you're like, well, actually, I don't know why that's the case. But the reason for it is because it's about the representation of what that previous head represented and what the new head represents. So the previous head represents the chopping away of ego. So getting rid of ego and then being replaced with a head that represents wisdom. So with an elephant head for Ganesh, so a common theory as you're getting older is that your ears and your nose just don't stop growing. And hopefully, as you grow older, you become wiser as well, and you gain more wisdom as you get older. For example, the eyes of an elephant are very small, but very fixed as well. So you're very fixed on focus on your path towards gaining wisdom. Now, that is a lot of depth and a lot of symbolism attached to that. And then all of a sudden, you go from this story where it's like, well, hang on, it's just this guy chopping someone's head off. And whilst it's really exciting to talk about, there's a lot of questions that come with it. But when the questions come, that's where the understanding of the deeper philosophies are really, really important. And I think one of the barriers to teachers sometimes engaging with that is because it is well outside of a lot of our staff's comfort zones to engage with that. What I'm very encouraged about is that there is some training that is going to be held by groups like NATRA, etc., to try and decolonise and make a lot of learning a lot more authentic. And I think just giving teachers the tools to be able to have those conversations is really, really important. And it's by no fault of teachers themselves. And I think we've discussed this before, Louisa, where either you or I have mentioned, actually, I've known nothing about that before. But the thing is that we've been brought up in a system whereby we've not necessarily been encouraged to find out more as well. And now that system is changing gradually. So the last thing I want is for teaching staff or educators to think, oh God, I feel really bad that I don't know enough about this or that I don't know enough about that. Well, who can blame me essentially? Because the thing is we've been part of a system that hasn't necessarily always encouraged it. So the thing is now that system is gradually changing, now we can bounce off it and be really cliche sort of quote here, but be that change that you want to see as we move forward.
Absolutely. You mentioned there are things that we get right. And from your perspective, you're just really encouraged that people are doing great things with the stories. Molly, is there anything else that you feel that RE teachers are doing well when we teach Sanatan Dharma?
I think one of the key things that people do really well is the act of puja.
Yeah.
And the fact, linking the senses to the puja tray and being in the Mandir or at the home shrine and all the sort of sequencing of events, but the symbolism of it and linking with the five senses, but also with the four key elements. I think we all do that really, really well, and that's represented really well in textbooks, etc. So people should keep on doing that and as best possible try and replicate that, so they can have the artifacts in the classroom for their students to handle. I did an activity for a local community group. It was for Scouts because they can get a World Religions badge as one of their badges. And I took them in purposely so that the students could hold them and handle them. And I didn't just take in Hindu objects, I took in objects from all different religions. And the Scout leaders were like, oh, no, you can't touch. I said, no, these are for students to actually handle. That's the whole point of them, is that students should be interacting with these and investigating them because we're curious by nature. And if we just have the artifacts on display in our classroom, but students don't actually handle them or see how they're used properly, then what's the point of having them?
Yeah.
You might as well just have a picture of them. I know it's been hard during COVID times, but now we are slightly seeing the ease of those things happening. We should be able to start handling things more in the classroom and go back to normal practice as soon as possible, really, and hopefully and really try and engage, set up a shrine. If you're one of those fans of the island kind of way of working, that's easy enough to do in the middle of your classroom and allow for that holistic approach within your practice for students to truly immerse themselves in seeing what it might be like, especially if you can't take them to a mandir to see it, then emulate it as much as possible. That doesn't mean that you're suddenly asking them to become religious believers of Hindu dharam. It's just allowing them to encounter the faith in practice, which a lot of us do really well already. Can I just go back to Ash's Ganesh point?
Go on, yeah.
Another beautiful story that shows how wise Ganesh is the story of Ganesh and his brother. His brother is Kartikeya, who is lesser known Kartikeya. I think you know which story I'm going to talk about, Ash, there. So Ganesh and Kartikeya think that they both are their best children. As every child does, they're the best child for their parents. And so the parents say, OK, we're going to send you off on a race around the world. And who comes back first is the winner, and we'll love that child the most. Off Kartikeya goes. Kartikeya's vehicle is a peacock, so he goes flying off. Ganesh doesn't really rush off, and he just walks round both of his parents, because for him, they are his entire world. And it just shows that actually you don't need to do great feats to show that you are truly loving of your family, truly loving of your parents, that actually simple things can speak volumes. And it also reiterates the idea that Ganesh is very wise, and at that time, wise beyond his years, because how many sort of young children would think to just walk around their parents to show that they are the world to them? Which I think is a story that young kids would really understand. The symbolism and the imagery of that is dead easy for young children to understand. and would be a good one for you to use in the classroom.
And actually, it's just reminded me of something I really wanted to ask you, just hearing you speak about the stories. But what is it that you love most about Sanatan Dharma?
For me, I love the fact that it's so diverse, that you can be, as Ash was saying, you can be an atheist or an agnostic and still be part of the Sanatan community and not feel estranged from it. The fact that we are so diverse in how we do things and there's no right or wrong way. Ash and myself, for example, are quite different in our perspectives and how we practice, but both of us are quite right to do how we want to, but neither of us is wrong either. And that's the beauty of Sanatan Dharam, is that it's quite pluralistic and holistic in its approach to life in general.
Ash, what about you?
Yeah, I think I'd resonate with a lot with what Molly's saying there. And I think a couple of things in particular would be there's a real lack of judgment within Sanatan Dharma. So this idea of whether it be a judgment from a higher being or a judgment between human beings as well. And the reason that there's a lack of judgment is because judgment as an act or as a thought process is maya. So maya meaning roughly translated into illusion. So my judgment of either of you two is literally only based purely on my paradigm and my experience if I was to judge you. So the thing is that if I was to judge you two, it's literally through my paradigm and my experience, which is also very limited. So judgment has no place. Judgment is useless. We just need to focus on experiencing as well and understanding that and this is where karma comes into it, there's positive and negative things that come out of our experiences and it's just going from that. But judgment is completely left to the side. And I think that's one thing that I particularly like about Sanatan Dharma. And I think something that I really appreciate about it is how dynamic and adaptable it is to an ever-evolving world. I think change is something that Sanatan Dharma really takes into account, that the world as it was thousands of years ago is not going to be the same as the world is today. So therefore you need to keep ensuring that you are adapting your values in accordance to your situation. And I think a couple of stories, so the story of Ram and Krishna, for example, if you look at those two stories, they basically exemplify that the most, really, because Ram and Krishna were two very different leaders. So Ram played by the rules. He's very famous for playing by the rules all the time. But that was what was needed for that situation. And if Krishna was to do the same as Ram, it would not be as productive as he was if he bent the rules a little bit, because that was what was required for that time. Sanatis are not shy to dispose of old scriptural teachings. So, for example, if something is outdated, we'll happily just say, right, that we'll keep it as an archive, but we have to understand that that is actually outdated and that it's more of a historical piece to say how things were, but not how it should actually be anymore as well. And we're not shy to necessarily, just because it was written by someone who was clearly respected at the time and things like that, doesn't mean that we disrespect it, but also understand that it's perhaps quite outdated for now. Now, I'm by no means a Sanskrit expert. I know the odd little quote, and just one bit that I always remember though, and again, I'm not an expert, but in terms of my pronunciation, I'll come out completely off, but ekam sattvaha bahuda vidanti, which basically means that truth is one, and wise people have called it by different names. And that's always really resonated with me. There's a lot of rivers leading towards one ocean. So the dynamism and adaptability and lack of judgment, I think, is what makes it work for me, particularly. I really appreciate that about it. And I just think in terms of my actual being and, you know, for example, if I feel like I've done something wrong per se, that always helps me just carry through, I suppose, in terms of my actual application to everyday life.
Amazing. Thank you. What a lovely answer. Just as we close, there's a couple of things I want to ask you, which is about the representation in the media and how positive or negative you feel that is, but also the sort of contribution to British culture that has been made. So, Molly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of students are fascinated by images of is the idea of ladies wearing the bindi and the difference between the bindi and the tilak mark. Ash referred to it before when he was talking about the sindoor being used on his son for the mundan ceremony. So the sindoor is the same as the tilak mark. It's the red paste that is used during the puja ceremony as well. And what is important to understand is that when people have that applied after puja, is that it's showing that they've been blessed, and it helps them to gain an insight into understanding Brahman during that act of puja itself. And there is a difference between that and the bindis that are used by girls at different parties, etc. And so there is a difference. The second one is just as a kind of piece of jewellery, so really, whereas the first one, the tilak mark, is used as a sort of spiritual connection point, really. I think also a lot of the media represents Hindus as all being vegetarian. Many Hindus are vegetarian, but not all Hindus are. And there is a diversity within kind of cultural lifestyles that Hindus will lead accordingly as well, their diet. And it just depends on family as well as your kind of birthright as well.
Amazing.
So I'm vegetarian. I'm not sure what dietary.
I'm vegetarian as well, but I wasn't always vegetarian. And I really do miss my KFC. But the thing is yeah. I'm a very spiteful vegetarian, but then I've built a conscience over time, and I'm thinking, oh, yeah, we drove past a KFC yesterday, and I was like, oh no, why am I vegetarian? But again, we've got to have when you start thinking of higher purposes and things like that, then that's what drags you back, I suppose. But yeah, I became vegetarian in my early 20s, so it's been probably around about 10 years that I've been vegetarian. But yeah, I miss it. But I know why I am, so that's what keeps me going.
Ash, Linda McCartney do like a popcorn chicken bucket. So it's vegetarian.
Wow.
It's not real chicken.
That's made it all better.
I swear to God, it is so lovely.
Is it?
I'm vegetarian as well. And if you taste this, I think it will fill that hole that KFC has left.
Will it? Thank you. I've been looking for that gap filler for a very long time, and I'm glad I've come onto the podcast to air it out.
Oh my goodness. I don't know if it's product placement. I promise you I'm not getting sponsored by Linda McCartney, but it's just delightful food. Other vegetarian brands are available. Just before we close, Molly, I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about something you're doing, which is you've got like a Decolonising RE group that you're starting up. Do you just want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's affiliated with NATRE. It's going to launch in September 2021, so that we're starting with the new academic year, etc. Because I know a lot of people are just really tired at this point in the year because of all the things we've gone through as teachers in secondary schools. And I know primary schools have had their own issues as well due to lockdowns, etc. So we thought, NATRE and myself thought it'd be better to start in September. So there will be an affiliated group. Lots of people have already signed up to join us, and it's looking at decolonising and giving authentic voices and authentic language to use in the classroom and help people to understand the concepts better that they are teaching to our young ones, whatever key stage they may be in, all the way from EYFS all the way up to Key Stage 5. So if people haven't already signed up, there will be a link within this podcast notes so that people can sign up to it that way as well.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Yes, great. That's so wonderful. And Ash, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we close?
Just, again, as we usually say, just enjoy what you're doing in the classroom. And I know that this is a lot to take on at this time, and I know that there's a lot to keep up with. And we are going through a big shift right now. However, just take it in your stride, take it one step at a time. It's going to take a long time, and no one's saying that you've got to change this overnight. It's about the intention rather than the immediate result as well. And I think if the intentions are right, we'll be able to get exactly where we need to be. But if we're looking for overnight success, you're going to be disappointed. The thing is, you've got to have longevity, and you've got to make sure that you're backing yourself all the way. And also just reach out to, with the group that Molly's making in September, just reach out for any questions or anything like that. It's really important that we've got an open, honest, transparent and approachable community moving forward. I think that's really, really important, because a lot of people will be going through this thinking, am I going to do it right? And the only way that you can make sure that we can do it right is by opening up and being honest about our practice with each other. Just more of a message of support, really, more than anything, I think.
Okay. Right. I'm going to make myself really vulnerable here, because I think this is what a lot of RE teachers are going to feel, and they're going to feel like not confident. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing Sanatan Dharma right, and I think I'm doing it different each time. So what I want before I go, because actually if people are listening, they're probably going to go, oh, she hasn't quite pronounced it right there. Because I think that's the journey that we're going to go on. We're not going to get it right first time. And actually we have to be willing to make the mistakes, but it is that intention, right? I'm going to try and get this right. So you tell me exactly how to pronounce it, and I will try and repeat it after you.
So I say it's Sanatan Dharma.
Sanatan Dharma.
That's a good effort, that, yeah.
Whereas I would say Dharam.
So you say Sanatan Dharam.
You can say Dharam though as well, to be honest with you. You can say Dharam as well.
Both of those are fine. To be honest, if I didn't pronounce a word correctly, whether it's a non-Christian Abrahamic faith or a different Dharmic faith, I wouldn't worry about it. I really wouldn't worry about it as a classroom practitioner. Because then students aren't going to have an oral examination on how they pronounce different words. And yes, we might aim to pronounce things correctly, And that would be the ideal. But the actual understanding of the concepts and being able to explain the concepts properly, that's the more important part. There is an app, and I can't remember what the app is, but I'll pass it on to Louisa so she can put it in the notes. There is an app that helps people with the correct pronunciation of different terms that people will find helpful. But don't worry about that bit. I would spend more time focusing on quality of lesson and getting the content and the concepts across properly than worrying about how you pronounce different words. Because within the Hindu tradition, as we've just shown, both Ash and myself have pronounced key concept differently. So it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It really doesn't.
Right. And I think that's a really lovely way to end, because I think that's going to feel empowering for people rather than make them feel nervous about getting it wrong. So thank you so much for both coming back onto the RE podcast. I think this has been an enlightening conversation, and I think there's going to be a lot of love from Twitter. So we'd love to hear from you. So please contact me at the RE podcast 1. Molly and Ash, I'm sure people would love to get in contact with you. So we'll put your Twitter handles in the show notes. Thank you so much for giving your time up to be with us today. So thank you.
No, it's been a pleasure.
And thank you for recording on your birthday.
Oh, do you know, that's commitment, right? That is commitment.
Yes. Absolutely.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE podcast discussing the decolonisation of RE with Ash Kundi and Molly Acharya. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Louisa Jane Smith. This has been the RE podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I've just proved it to you. But thank you so much for letting me bore the life out of you.